"I have 3 PhDs, Margaret Collins said calmly. The hall exploded in laughter. Richard Hale, champagne glass raised, pointed at her with a mocking smile. 3 PhDs? In what? Boiling eggs? Under the crystal chandeliers, the models in glittering gowns laughed in chorus. Men in tuxedos clinked their glasses as if her humiliation were part of the entertainment. The marble floors, the luxury cars outside, the fountains sparkling in the distance, everything screamed wealth and excess. Everything except her. Margaret, in her plain grey dress and worn shoes, stood motionless. Her lined face spoke of a life weathered by storms, and in her eyes there was something none of them recognized, a silent dignity, a strength that refused to bend before their scorn. What seemed like a cruel joke to the rich was about to ignite a confrontation that would shake everyone in that mansion. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching. And don't forget to leave your like to keep following us. The chandeliers burned like constellations above the marble hall, scattering light over crystal glasses, golden cutlery, and gowns that shimmered as if woven from starlight. The Hale mansion, perched high in the Hollywood Hills, breathed extravagance. Every corner polished, every detail designed to impress. Guests in tuxedos and sequined dresses drifted through the ballroom, their laughter sharp as champagne bubbles. Through the towering front doors stepped Margaret Collins. Her figure was small, almost fragile against the flood of opulence. 65 years old, her silver hair tied neatly in a bun, she wore a plain grey dress covered by a faded apron. In her hand, she clutched a worn leather bag and a wooden spoon tucked in the pocket, as though it was her shield. Her entrance barely stirred the air until one of the models near the staircase gasped theatrically. "Who let the maid in through the front?" the woman whispered, her jeweled hand covering a smirk. Others turned, their eyes sliding over Margaret as though she were an intruder in their kingdom of glass. Richard Hale himself descended the grand staircase. The billionaire CEO moved with the confidence of a man who believed the room itself existed to spotlight him. His midnight blue tuxedo caught the glow of chandeliers, his smile too sharp to be warm. Spotting Margaret, he slowed, his lips curving in amusement. "Well," Richard said loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. He gestured toward her with a mocking bow. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's entertainment has arrived, our new cook." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Champagne glasses tilted, diamonds shook with every giggle. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, her knuckles white around her bag strap. She opened her mouth to speak, but Richard raised a finger like a conductor silencing an orchestra. "I only hope," he continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "that you can at least boil an egg without setting off the fire alarms." The hall erupted again. A businessman nearly spilled his drink from laughing. A young influencer lifted her phone, pretending to film Margaret like she was some street performance. Margaret did not answer. Her eyes, deep and calm, met Richard's with a silence sharper than any insult. She inhaled once, slowly, and walked past him toward the kitchen. The laughter trailed behind her like smoke. As the door swung closed behind her, a quiet fell. For the briefest moment, Richard's grin faltered, unsettled by the dignity with which she carried humiliation. Then, with a snap of his fingers to the waiter, he buried the unease beneath another toast. But the first crack had already formed in his perfect night. The Hale mansion pulsed with music and murmurs, the rhythm of wealth echoing through its gilded walls. Waiters glided between clusters of glittering guests, balancing silver trays that reflected candlelight like fragments of a broken sun. Yet amid all the sparkle, whispers about the cook's arrival lingered, buzzing like a fly no one could swat. In the kitchen, Margaret set her bag down carefully on the stainless steel counter. She placed her hands on the cool surface, steadying herself against the tide of humiliation she had just walked through. Around her, younger staff exchanged glances, half pity, half embarrassment. One busboy muttered under his breath, "Poor lady, doesn't know what she stepped into." Meanwhile, in the dining hall, Richard raised his glass. His smile was predatory, his tone light, but sharpened to cut. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's hope our dinner tonight is more palatable than last week's disaster. I've hired someone new, a seasoned cook." His paws hung in the air, the word seasoned carrying a poisonous undertone. He flicked his eyes toward the kitchen door, ensuring everyone caught the joke. Laughter rose once more. A model in silver leaned into her date, whispering loud enough for half the table to hear, "She looks like someone's grandmother, not a chef." Another chimed in, "Maybe she'll serve mashed potatoes and jello retirement home style." The table roared. Inside the kitchen, the muffled echoes of mockery seeped through the walls. Margaret tightened the knot of her apron. Her fingers trembled only once before stilling. She moved with deliberate calm, unpacking the contents of her bag, knives wrapped in worn leather, measuring spoons, a scale, notebooks with frayed edges. Each item was placed as though she were setting up an experiment, not preparing a dinner. Suddenly, the door swung open. Richard appeared, framed by the light of the ballroom. His presence filled the room like smoke. He strolled in, one hand in his pocket, the other twirling the stem of a half-empty glass of champagne. "Tell me, Margaret," he drawled, his voice dripping with theatrical curiosity. "Do you know how to handle caviar, or is spaghetti your specialty?" The younger staff stiffened. One dishwasher dropped a plate, the crash echoing like a gunshot. Richard smirked at the sound, as if the universe itself were applauding him. Margaret lifted her gaze, her eyes level and steady. For a moment, the room felt strangely hushed, as though even the boiling pots paused to listen. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she reached for a sharpened knife, tested its balance in her palm, and then began chopping onions with a speed and precision that silenced the snickers around her. The billionaire tilted his head, amused yet faintly unsettled. "Impressive knife skills," he said mockingly, raising his glass in a toast to himself. "But let's see if skill translates to flavor. I don't pay for theatrics, I pay for perfection." He turned and left, his laughter trailing back into the golden hall. Margaret exhaled slowly, her face calm, her eyes resolute. The underestimation had begun. The kitchen door thudded shut behind Richard, muting the laughter but not erasing it. The echo clung to the walls like smoke after a fire. Margaret stood still for a long breath, her hand resting on the handle of the knife she had just used, her shoulders squared. Around her, the younger staff returned to motion, but cautiously, almost as if they feared that touching the silence she carried might burn them. She opened her bag again, pulling out something unexpected, a slim, black notebook lined with formulas and meticulous handwriting. Not recipes, but equations, calculations that spoke of chemical reactions, of temperatures balanced to the decimal, of proteins folded with surgical care. She placed it beside the scale, then began weighing flour, not with scoops, but with precision, jotting notes as though she were in a laboratory. The sous chef, a young man named Daniel with rolled-up sleeves and skeptical eyes, leaned closer. "What are you doing?" he asked, his tone half mocking, half genuinely confused. Margaret didn't look up. "Ensuring accuracy." Her voice was soft but firm, unshaken. Daniel chuckled. "Accuracy. This is a party, not a science experiment." He gestured toward the grand hall. "They just want pretty plates, that's all. Nobody cares about whatever that is." Margaret paused, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were calm, unblinking, carrying weight far older than his youth could fathom. "Someone always cares," she said quietly, then returned to her notebook. At the far side of the kitchen, the butler, Mr. Harris, observed silently. Older than most of the staff, with a back still straight despite years of service, he noticed details others ignored. He watched how Margaret adjusted the oven's temperature by instinct, then double-checked it with a thermometer she carried in her pocket. He noticed how she asked about dietary restrictions, not just the obvious ones, but subtle questions. Any guests with peanut allergies, shellfish intolerances, gluten sensitivities? The other staff exchanged baffled glances. No one ever asked. When Daniel scoffed again, muttering something about grandma overthinking dinner, Mr. Harris cut him off with a single look, the kind of look that could silence a room. Then, turning back to Margaret, he said, "You've done this before." She smiled faintly, not at him, but at the memory flickering behind her eyes. "Yes," she murmured, her hand steady as she scribbled another note. "For most of my life." Unseen by the guests, Unseen by Richard himself, a shadow of truth stretched across the kitchen. Every movement Margaret made carried the weight of training, of years in sterile labs and academic halls, though no one in the mansion could imagine it yet. The clatter and chatter of the ballroom drifted in again as the door cracked open, a waitress peeking through to collect appetizers. She glanced at the setup on Margaret's counter. Beakers, scales, numbers scribbled in the margins of her notebook. "Weird," she whispered under her breath, shaking her head as she left. But Harris stayed fixed on Margaret, his eyes narrowing as if piecing together a puzzle. He had served men like Richard all his life, men who believed money was the only form of power. Yet something in the way Margaret measured salt with the precision of a chemist whispered that another kind of power had just walked into this house. And though no one else realized it, the air in the mansion had already shifted. The clock in the kitchen ticked past 8, its steady rhythm drowned by the thump of electronic music reverberating through the marble floors above. Waiters hurried in and out, balancing trays, calling out orders, their nerves stretched thin by the demands of the guests. Yet in the center of the storm, Margaret moved with unhurried precision. She began by wiping the counters until they gleamed, then arranging her tools in perfect order. Knives aligned like surgical instruments, bowls set by size, ingredients portioned on the scale. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. She checked the temperature of the refrigerators, adjusted the flame under each stove and scribbled notes in her black notebook. To the other cooks, it looked strange. This was supposed to be chaos. Food flying, pans clattering, oil sizzling in frantic waves. Instead, Margaret's kitchen looked like a laboratory where silence was an ally. Daniel, the sous chef, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "This isn't how we do things here," he muttered, loud enough for others to nod in agreement. "You don't need formulas for a roast chicken." Margaret didn't answer. She was grinding spices with deliberate force, her eyes focused. The sound of the mortar and pestle, stone against stone, drowned his complaint. One of the waitresses peeked inside again, curious. "What's she doing now?" she whispered to another. Margaret had set up a row of small glass containers, labeling each with a piece of tape and handwriting that looked more suited for a science journal than a kitchen. Liquids shimmered under the light, emulsions, reductions, extracts. Daniel scoffed. "What is this chemistry class?" He laughed, but it came out forced, his voice cracking in the middle. "Mr. Harris, standing near the door, finally spoke. "No," he said, his voice calm and firm, silencing the room. "It's discipline." Margaret didn't even glance at him, but the faintest smile curved her lips as she moved on to slicing vegetables so thin they looked transparent. Each piece was identical, as though cut by machine. Above, the music swelled again. Guests clinked glasses, laughter tumbling through the ceiling like thunder. In the kitchen, a pot began to steam, filling the room with the earthy scent of mushrooms, layered with something more mysterious. The fragrance spread slowly, curling into the air vents, carried upward into the hall. Conversations paused for the briefest moment as noses twitched and eyes glanced toward the kitchen. "Whatever that is," one woman whispered to her table, "it smells different." Back downstairs, Daniel shifted uncomfortably, watching Margaret work. For every smirk he had offered earlier, doubt now tugged at his features. Her hands never shook, her eyes never faltered. She was building something far beyond his comprehension. Margaret set the first dish aside, covered carefully with a silver lid. She wiped her hands, checked her notebook again, and then turned to the next station. The kitchen, once a place of chaos, now pulsed with a strange calm, as though under the spell of her control. It was order born from years of knowledge, the kind of order that could not be bought, no matter how many millions Richard Hale kept in his accounts. And soon, that order would shake his kingdom of noise. The double doors to the grand dining hall opened, and a hush rolled through the room like a tide pulling back before a storm. Waiters emerged carrying silver trays, each lid gleaming beneath the chandeliers. Conversations that had been light and careless moments earlier began to fragment as heads turned. Curiosity piqued by the strange aroma that drifted with the dishes, rich, layered, unfamiliar, yet magnetic. Richard Hale lifted his glass again, smirking. ready to dismiss whatever grandmother cooking was about to arrive. But the moment the first plate was set before him, his brow creased. The dish did not look rustic or simple. It looked like art, vibrant colors arranged in precise patterns, textures playing against one another with deliberate elegance. A sphere, delicate and translucent, quivered atop a bed of greens, glistening like glass. "What in the world is this?" asked one guest, leaning closer, his voice caught between awe and confusion. The first fork pierced the sphere. It burst gently, releasing a mist of flavor, truffle, rosemary, a whisper of citrus, flooding the air around it. Gasps rippled across the table. "Is this molecular gastronomy?" murmured a woman in pearls, her eyes wide. Richard laughed sharply. "A parlor trick," he declared, stabbing the dish with exaggerated disdain. But when he brought the fork to his mouth, his laughter thinned. His tongue, accustomed to the finest French restaurants and Michelin-starred chefs, paused in surprise. His eyes betrayed him for a fraction of a second before he swallowed and quickly masked the slip with another smirk. The guests, however, were not so restrained. A food critic at the far end of the table leaned forward, his fork moving urgently from one texture to the next. "This is extraordinary," he whispered, almost to himself. "The balance, the precision, it's like nothing I've tasted in Los Angeles." The MC for the evening, a flamboyant socialite, clapped her hands. "Darling, this isn't dinner. This is performance." Applause scattered across the hall, hesitant at first, then swelling. Richard tried to laugh over it, but his voice was drowned out by the enthusiasm rising around him. Guests were leaning across tables, comparing flavors, sharing plates, pointing toward the kitchen as though demanding to know who had created such marvels. The second course arrived, thin sheets of caramelized vegetables folded into origami-like shapes, holding a reduction sauce so delicate that a single drop lingered on the tongue for minutes. Conversations shifted from gossip about film premieres to dissecting each flavor with reverence. Even the ambassador of France, seated near the head of the table, raised his eyebrows in admiration. "Who is this chef?" he asked aloud, his accent wrapping the question in authority. "I must know." The name Margaret Collins circulated in whispers, at first uncertain, then insistent, until it rolled across the hall. The very same woman they had laughed at less than an hour ago. In the kitchen, Margaret was plating the third course, her movements calm, her expression unreadable. She did not hear the applause echoing down the corridor, or perhaps she chose not to react. Her focus remained absolute, each detail weighed, each texture tested. But the tide had already turned. Above, Richard Hale sat in his seat, his grip tightening on the stem of his glass as though holding it harder could stop the ground from shifting beneath him. The banquet was no longer his performance. It was hers. The hall vibrated with a restless energy. Guests leaned forward in their seats, forks resting on plates, their conversations replaced by murmurs of wonder. Even the orchestra in the corner, hired only as background ambiance, had faltered into silence, their instruments lowered as if they too wanted to savor what lingered in the air. Richard Hale's jaw tightened. His evening, meant to showcase his power and opulence, had been hijacked by a woman he'd mocked in front of everyone. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, forcing a brittle smile. "Well," he said loudly, "I suppose even a blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while." The forced laughter from his side of the table rang hollow. Before the sound faded, the doors opened again. This time, Margaret herself entered. She did not glide, she did not bow. She walked in with the same quiet dignity with which she had first arrived, her plain grey dress a sharp contrast to the diamonds and designer gowns that surrounded her. Yet now every eye turned to her, not with derision, but with anticipation. She moved to the center of the room, her hands folded loosely in front of her. The silence was so complete that the crackling of the fireplace seemed thunderous. For a long moment she simply stood, scanning the faces that had ridiculed her hours before. Their laughter had evaporated. Richard cleared his throat, irritated. "Are you here to take a bow, cook? Don't let it go to your head. One decent dinner doesn't make you—" Margaret raised her hand, silencing him without a word. Her voice, when it came, was calm, but carried weight enough to reach every corner of the room. "I've listened to your jokes. I've carried your mockery in silence. But tonight, I believe it's time you know who I am." A ripple of curiosity shivered through the crowd. Phones discreetly lifted, cameras recording. The ambassador leaned forward, his gaze locked on her. "I am Margaret Collins," she continued, her voice steady, unshaken. "And I have 3 PhDs, biochemistry, nutrition, and food science." The words detonated like fireworks in the still air. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath, the clatter of a fork dropped on porcelain. For a heartbeat, even Richard was frozen, his practiced grin collapsing into bewilderment. Margaret held their stunned silence with ease. "For 40 years, I taught and researched. I lectured in universities you could never buy your way into, published papers that shaped industries you profit from, and yet here I stand in your kitchen treated like someone unworthy of your respect." The crowd stirred uneasily. Guests who had laughed at her entrance now avoided her gaze, shame coloring their cheeks. A few clapped cautiously, but most remained too stunned to move. Richard recovered enough to bark a laugh, but the sound cracked. "PhDs, please. Anyone can claim titles. Do you expect us to believe—" But even as his words fell, several guests whispered to each other, recognizing her name. One critic leaned across the table, murmuring, "I've seen her at a symposium in New York years ago. She was the keynote speaker." Margaret's eyes met Richard's across the table, calm, unflinching. The power in the room no longer belonged to him, and Richard knew it. The air inside the hall was thick, charged, as though lightning had struck and frozen in place. Margaret's revelation still hung over the guests, suspended in silence, broken only by the faint clinking of a glass as someone nervously adjusted their drink. Richard's smirk had vanished, replaced by a strained mask that barely concealed the fury tightening his jaw. Margaret did not flinch. Slowly, she reached into the worn leather bag she had carried since her arrival. From it, she withdrew several folders, their edges softened by years of handling. She placed them on the table at the center of the room, pushing aside a half-finished bottle of vintage wine without hesitation. The gesture, unhurried yet firm, commanded attention. The ambassador rose halfway from his chair, leaning forward. "May I?" he asked, his hand hovering above the documents. Margaret nodded. "Please." The ambassador opened the first folder. Inside lay a diploma, embossed with the seal of Harvard University. Gasps rippled through the hall. He turned the page. Another from MIT, and then a third from Stanford. Each certificate bore her name, Margaret Collins, PhD. Whispers erupted. "Impossible. She's lying." "No. Look at the signatures." A food critic seated nearby squinted at a photograph clipped to one of the folders. Margaret standing at a podium, delivering a lecture, a screen behind her displaying a molecular structure. "I remember this conference," he said aloud, voice shaking. "New York, 2005. She presented groundbreaking research on enzymatic reactions in gastronomy. I was there." Others began to murmur in agreement, fragments of memory surfacing. "I saw her published in the Journal of Nutritional Science. She collaborated with the French Institute. Yes, I read her work." The tide swelled faster than Richard could contain it. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "This proves nothing," he snapped, his voice trembling. "Anyone can forge papers and photographs. Do you really believe a woman like her, dressed like that, cooking in my kitchen, could be some scientific authority?" But his protest sounded desperate, brittle. The ambassador closed the folder gently, his expression solemn. "Forged?" he repeated, his accent slicing through the tension. "These are no forgeries. I have attended her lectures myself. Madam Collins, your work was widely respected. Your research on food stability influenced international policy." He turned, eyes narrowing at Richard. "How dare you ridicule her?" The hall erupted, not with laughter, but with indignation. Guests whispered harshly, their earlier mockery now souring into shame. Some turned their eyes away from Richard, unwilling to be associated with his arrogance. Others leaned toward Margaret, curiosity and admiration softening their faces. Margaret remained composed, her hands folded lightly before her. She did not bask in their sudden respect, nor did she gloat. She simply stood, steady and unshaken, as though she had been waiting her whole life for this moment of truth to speak for itself. Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly. He looked around the room, seeking support, but found none. His empire of laughter had crumbled, replaced by an audience that no longer recognized him as the master of the evening. And in the silence that followed, it was clear. Margaret's proof had not only validated her, it had dismantled him. Richard's glass slipped from his hand, striking the table with a hollow thud. Red wine bled across the white linen, spreading like a wound. Nobody moved to clean it. All eyes were locked on him, watching the man who had mocked the cook, now cornered, stripped of his untouchable aura. He forced a laugh, brittle and sharp. Let's not exaggerate. A few papers, a few speeches. So what? This is a dinner party, not a lecture hall. His voice faltered at the edges, desperation leaking through the cracks. But the guests were no longer on his side. A well-known critic leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. So what? He repeated coldly. You ridiculed her expertise while sitting on wealth you barely understand. She's contributed more to science and food culture than you ever will. The ambassador nodded gravely. Respect is not bought, Mr. Hale. It is earned. His words cut through the room like a blade, drawing murmurs of agreement. Richard's face flushed crimson. He turned toward Margaret, his finger stabbing the air. You planned this, didn't you? You wanted to humiliate me in front of my guests in my home. Margaret didn't move. She met his accusation with a calm silence that was louder than any defense. Her stillness became a mirror in which Richard saw himself, petty, furious, ridiculous. The room's atmosphere shifted again, but this time against him. Guests whispered behind their hands. Some shook their heads. A few openly laughed, not at Margaret, but at him. His empire of admiration had collapsed into a circus of pity. Richard, one woman called from the far end of the table, her voice laced with disdain. For once, just admit you were wrong. His jaw clenched. I don't admit weakness. Then you admit ignorance, another guest shot back, her words drawing soft applause. The orchestra, sensing the moment, struck a note of irony. A violinist plucked a mocking tune that made the humiliation sting sharper. Richard whipped toward them, but the smirks on the musicians' faces told him the damage was beyond repair. He tried to rise, to storm out, but his chair tangled with the tablecloth, dragging silverware and crystal to the floor in a crash that silenced even the whispers. His struggle to free himself looked clumsy, childlike. For a man who had built his image on control, the sight was devastating. Margaret finally spoke, her voice low but steady. You wanted me invisible. Tonight you made me visible, and in doing so you revealed yourself. Her words hung in the air, final and irrefutable. Richard sank back into his chair, defeated, his hand trembling around the stem of a new glass poured hastily by a waiter who no longer respected him. The once mighty billionaire sat shrunken, reduced to a man stripped bare before his kingdom, and everyone knew the humiliation was complete. The hall had turned against him. What was once Richard Hale's stage of triumph now felt like a courtroom, and every guest, every whisper, every sidelong glance was a verdict of guilt. The billionaire sat rigid in his chair, his chest heaving with a mixture of anger and panic. He could not bear the silence pressing down on him, so he reached for the only weapon he had ever trusted, money. He rose suddenly, lifting his glass as though to reclaim command. His voice boomed, forced and theatrical. Ladies and gentlemen, enough of this charade. Clearly our cook is more than a cook. So let's do what powerful people do. Let's make a deal. Eyes narrowed across the table. Some leaned forward, sensing the desperation in his tone. Richard's gaze fixed on Margaret. I'll pay you $5 million a year, he announced, each word slow and heavy, as if throwing gold coins onto the floor. Exclusive contract. You will work for me, and only me. Your science, your knowledge, your food, mine. I'll give you a lab assistance, anything you want. Gasps circled the table. Some guests murmured in awe at the sum, others in disgust. The orchestra had fallen silent again. All eyes darted to Margaret, waiting for her reaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. Slowly, she rose from her chair, her plain dress brushing against the floor. The hall held its breath. Margaret stepped closer to Richard, her gaze unwavering. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. but it carried like a blade through the stillness. My knowledge is not for sale, my dignity is not for sale, and certainly not to you. The words detonated inside the room. Gasps, sharp inhalations, even a stifled laugh from someone who couldn't believe the audacity. Richard's smile faltered. He leaned forward, desperate. 10 million then? 20. Name your price. Margaret shook her head, her silver hair catching the chandelier's glow. You still don't understand. What I carry cannot be bought. It is earned through decades of work, of sacrifice, of silence you could never endure. A murmur of approval spread through the guests. Some began to clap softly, then louder, until the hall filled with applause. Not for Richard's wealth, but for Margaret's refusal. Richard's face crumbled, his hand trembling as he set his glass down too hard, cracking its rim. He looked around the room but found no allies, only eyes filled with respect for the woman he had tried to belittle. Margaret turned to the crowd, her expression composed. I came here tonight to cook, nothing more. But your host chose to turn my presence into a spectacle. He believed that laughter would make me small. Instead, it revealed just how small he is. The applause swelled. Some guests rose to their feet, clapping with the fervor of those who had just witnessed history unfold in a mansion that suddenly felt more like a theater. Richard collapsed into his chair, pale, his empire of arrogance collapsing around him, and Margaret stood tall, untouched, her refusal echoing louder than any fortune he could offer. The applause echoed against the gilded walls, drowning the very music meant to elevate Richard Hale's party. Guests stood scattered across the dining hall, some clapping with awe, others whispering to one another as though recounting what they had just witnessed to make sure it was real. Margaret, however, did not bask in the noise. She simply lowered her gaze, gathered her worn leather bag from the table, and folded the documents back into it. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, dignified, as if this night, which had shattered Richard's image, was merely another chapter in a life already filled with storms weathered and lessons earned. She turned toward the grand doors, her steps slow but certain. Each sound of her shoes against the marble floor resonated like a gavel striking down judgment. No one tried to stop her. No one mocked her anymore. Even the most glamorous model who had laughed earlier now looked down at her diamond bracelet, ashamed to meet Margaret's eyes. Richard sat hunched in his chair, his face pale beneath the golden light. He clutched the stem of a broken glass like a lifeline, but no one offered him rescue. His empire, built on arrogance, on the belief that money could buy reverence, had collapsed in front of the very people he sought to impress. In a last, desperate attempt, he called after her. "Margaret!" His voice cracked raw. "You can't just walk away, you belong here, you—" She stopped, her back to him, the silence swallowing his plea. Slowly she turned her head just enough for her voice to carry across the hall. "I never belonged here, and neither do you." The words landed heavier than any blow. Richard's mouth opened, but no reply came. The room around him remained frozen in that truth. Margaret stepped through the towering doors. They closed behind her with a resonant thud, sealing the moment. Outside, the night air of the Hollywood Hills wrapped around her, cool and free. The hum of crickets replaced the muffled echoes of champagne-soaked laughter. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself a breath deep enough to feel in her bones. Inside, the guests began to disperse. The critic scribbled frantic notes on a napkin. The ambassador shook his head, muttering about wasted arrogance. The models gathered their coats in silence, their earlier laughter forgotten. One by one they slipped away, leaving Richard alone at his table, staring into the reflection of his empire in the darkened glass of the mansion windows. There, in the mirrored surface, he saw not a billionaire surrounded by admirers, but a hollow man clutching a broken glass, abandoned in a palace of silence. And outside, Margaret walked down the driveway lined with luxury cars, her steps steady, her bag clutched against her side. She did not look back, for she had already left her mark, not just on the night, not just on the guests, but on the man who had believed the world itself could be bought. And now he knew it could not. The night that began with mockery ended with silence, a silence heavier than any insult. Richard Hale, once the center of attention, sat alone, surrounded by shattered pride and empty glasses. His wealth, his arrogance, his power, all of it had been useless against the quiet strength of one woman. Margaret Collins walked away from that mansion not with millions, not with contracts, but with something far greater. Her dignity intact, her truth unshaken, and the respect of those who once laughed at her. She proved that real worth cannot be bought or sold. It is carried within, built through sacrifice, knowledge, and courage. And for everyone watching, her story reminds us of something essential. No matter the humiliation, no matter the doubt, dignity will always shine through. There is always hope for those who walk with truth even when the world tries to silence them. Hold on to your dignity. Believe in your own worth, because that is a treasure no one can take away. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heart-touching story. Tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.